The U.S. Naval War College is the Navy's home of thought. Established in 1884, NWC has become the center of naval sea power, both strategically and intellectually. The following Issues in National Security lecture is specifically designed to offer scholarly lectures to all participants. We hope you enjoy this upcoming discussion and future lectures.
Good afternoon, and welcome to our 10th and final Issues in National Security lecture for this academic year. I am Captain Dunn Ricino, and it's my pleasure to be the host for today's event. I'd like to note that we are gathered here together in person, and we also have a large audience dialed in via Zoom. Over the 2024 to 2025 academic year, we have been offering lectures from some of the best scholars in the world, from our resident faculty. This effort is intended to share a portion of the Naval War College's academic experience with the spouses and significant others of our student body. And we also welcome participation by the entire Naval War College extended family, including members of the Naval War College Foundation, international sponsors, civilian employees, colleagues throughout Naval Station Newport, and others around the globe. While the primary purpose is to share information and learn together, we do offer documentation in the form of certificates of completion to all participants who attend at least 70% of the offered lectures. You can participate here in the audience, via Zoom, or even by watching the lectures when they are posted on YouTube. We ask you to keep track of how and when you participate. You can now self-certify by completing the Microsoft form, which will be available on the Issues in National Security page on the Naval War College website. We will also paste a link to the form in the Zoom chat for those joining virtually. If you have any questions, please email the INS Deputy Director, Christopher Faulkner. At the conclusion of the presentation that follows, we will welcome questions from our in-person audience. Please use the microphones located at each seat so all of us, including our virtual participants, can hear the question. In this lecture, Professor John Maurer will examine Winston Churchill's lifelong connection to the United States. Professor John H. Maurer is the Alfred Thayer Mahan Professor of Sea Power and Grand Strategy and served as the chair of the Strategy and Policy Department. His most recent book is the edited volume, The Road to Pearl Harbor, Great Power War and Asia and the Pacific. At the college, he teaches a course on Winston Churchill and the history of the two world wars. In recognition of his contribution to professional military education, he has received the U.S. Navy's Meritorious Civilian Service Award and Superior Civilian Service Award. Please join me in welcoming Professor Maurer.
Thank you so much. Thank you for that introduction to this evening's lecture. The topic I am going to be dealing with today is Winston Churchill's long association with the United States. Churchill was the product of a union between Britain and America. His father was Lord Randolph Churchill, the second son of the Duke of Marlborough. So Churchill belonged to the British aristocracy. But his mother was Jennie Jerome, who was born in 1854 in Brooklyn. So his mother was an American expatriate who had moved to Europe with her mother. There you see Lord and Lady Churchill in 1874, the year of Churchill's birth. Churchill wrote in his autobiography about his relationship with his parents. He had an all too typical Victorian upbringing, meaning that he was distant emotionally, physically from his parents. In fact, it was his nanny, Mrs. Everest, that was the real maternal figure in his life. Well, Churchill wrote about his mother that he loved her dearly, but at a distance. Churchill was a devoted son to his mother throughout her life. His grandfather on the American side, Jennie Jerome's father, was Leonard Jerome, who was a New York financier who made and lost several fortunes on Wall Street. He was also quite a sports enthusiast, supporting horse racing in the United States at the end of the 19th century. For a while, he was a part owner of the New York Times. During the Civil War in 1863, when there were draft riots in New York City, Leonard Jerome helped guard the offices of the New York Times against the rioters. Again, a long distinguished American side to Churchill's lineage. Well, Churchill, as a young boy, and here he is as a 9-year-old, a photograph. In his autobiography, he wrote, "Yeah, I'm a bad boy." Again, in part, perhaps, if I can engage in some pop psychology, engaging in negative attention getting, we would say, to try to get his parents' attention. Well, here's his report card as a 9-year-old at school. You can all read that, right? No, of course not. Look at this. This is what his headmaster is writing about him. "Conduct has been exceedingly bad. He's not to be trusted to do any one thing." Very disgraceful. This is its attendance. He's missed class 20 times. Very bad. Again, looking at general conduct, very bad. Constant trouble, always getting into scrapes. Cannot be trusted to behave himself. What an awful report card. We wouldn't want that for our kids, would we? The headmaster, though, did note that there are some positive aspects to him. That in his studies in geography and history, he's very good, especially in history. And Churchill was quite an avid history reader and believed it was important for policymakers as well as academics, but for leaders to read history. History was a way of learning from past experience. It was important for leaders to read history. And Churchill not only read history, he was going to write the history as well of his time. And finally, he has some good abilities. He sure does. Well, again, what a mixed report card that is. In 1895, at the age of 20, he graduated from the British Military Academy, Sandhurst. And here you see him as a young 20-something cavalry officer, a hussar. That's quite a colorized photograph there. There's a black and white original, but I thought, I have to use this colorized version because it really stands out how striking the uniforms were of the time. Well, Churchill, at the age of 20, went to the United States for the first time. He was on his way to Cuba. At that time, the Spanish army was fighting a Cuban insurgency. Churchill had just graduated from the military academy, and he wanted to see firsthand combat. Even though this was a war not involving the British Empire, he wanted to see fighting firsthand. And so he was invited by the Spanish army to come to Cuba. On the way to Cuba, he came to the United States. While in the United States, at the age of 20, he wrote this to his mother: "The Americans are extraordinary people." And to his brother, younger brother Jack, "It's a great country. The Americans are practical." By the way, Churchill probably saw combat for the first time on his 21st birthday on November 30th, 1875. He was in Cuba at the time, and he records that bullets went whizzing around his head. What a way to spend your 21st birthday. Well, Winston Churchill, as a young man in his 20s, saw a great deal of combat. In addition to being in Cuba and watching the Spanish army fight the Cuban insurgency, he also fought on the northwest frontier of Britain's Indian Empire, modern-day Afghanistan and Pakistan. He saw a great deal of combat action there. In addition, in 1898, he was at the Sudan, fighting a war there. He took part in the Battle of Omdurman, in which there was a great British cavalry charge. and he took part in that cavalry charge. He came close to being killed at the time. And at the end of the 19th, the beginning of the 20th century, he took part in the Boer War of South Africa, where the British Empire fought against the Boer republics, crushing their independence. Churchill, by the way, was a great admirer of the British Empire. He believed that the British Empire was a positive force in world affairs. So he was a supporter of this war against these South African Boer republics. Well, here's a photograph of him from the time of the Boer War. Well, in the Boer War in South Africa, he was taken prisoner by the Boers. There was a British armored train that was ambushed by the Boers. And Churchill was a journalist at the time, but a journalist in uniform, and he was captured by the Boers. He maintained that he was a journalist and should be made a prisoner of war. But the Boers had watched him during this ambush of the train. And they said, "You're not acting like a journalist, you're acting like a soldier, an officer, directing the fighting that was taking place." Well, Churchill could not stand being a prisoner of war. So at the first opportunity, he went over the fence and tried to escape, and did escape. He then, as a journalist, wrote a story about how I escaped from the Boers. He was a big national hero in Britain because of his bravery in trying to escape. And here you see the Boer wanted poster for him, where Churchill, there's a 25-pound reward if you bring him in, dead or alive. There you see Churchill by a wrecked train. Well, Churchill came back to the United States at the end of 1900. He had gone back to Britain after his experience in South Africa, ran for Parliament in a general election that took place in Britain at that time, and was elected for the first time to serve in the British Parliament. Because of his experience in the Boer War, he was enough of a celebrity that he could come to the United States and give a lecture tour. So he had booked up a whole series of lectures in the United States, very lucrative for him. Churchill made a great deal of money through journalism and through his lectures. Well, here's a colorized photograph of him from 1900. Well, when he arrived in New York, the big question, he was mobbed by journalists who asked him, "Were you coming to the United States to get married? Are you looking for an American bride?" Again, his father had married an American woman. And this is what he had to tell the journalists, that he wants to deny it, that his interest here is coming to be married. Actually, again, his interest is to make money. Well, the second lecture that he gave was in New York City at the Waldorf Astoria Hotel. And there were 1,000 people in the audience. And guess who introduced him? Mark Twain. Wow. I would pay good money to go to see that lecture, to see these two celebrity authors together. Mark Twain introduced him, and Mark Twain was quite an anti-imperialist, by the way. And so he starts off by saying that he has different views from Winston Churchill. Churchill is an admirer of empire, whereas empires are bad things, and the United States is starting to behave like the British Empire in the wake of the Spanish-American War, and we shouldn't get involved in empire building. So despite their political differences, though, Mark Twain said, "Yes, but he's an admirable young man, and we should listen to him intently." Again, what an evening that must have been. Well, Churchill and presidents. Churchill, in the 70-some years of his political life, these are the American presidents that he met and actually had conversations with. Isn't this an incredible roll call of American presidents? Beginning with President McKinley back in 1900, and with Theodore Roosevelt, who was then the vice president-elect. You'll notice what presidents are missing. Well, the Republican William Howard Taft between Theodore Roosevelt and Woodrow Wilson, and the two Republican presidents between Wilson and Hoover, Warren Harding and Calvin Coolidge. By the way, President Gerald Ford saw Churchill give a speech to a joint session of Congress, but didn't get the opportunity to actually have a conversation with him. But look at the span of American history and American leaders that he dealt with. It's fascinating to think that in one life, he met all of these leaders. Well, Churchill quite often didn't make a good first impression on people. We say how important first impressions are. Well, in Churchill's case, he would fail the test. In 1900, when he came to the United States for the second time, he was invited up to Albany to have dinner with Theodore Roosevelt, who was then governor of New York State and the vice president-elect of the United States. Well, when Churchill went to leave, he did the faux pas of forgetting to thank the hostess for the dinner. Anyway, Theodore Roosevelt wrote to his son, Theodore Roosevelt Jr., a letter in which he says he hates to have to behave like a swine, to correct somebody else. Again, calling Churchill a swine. And why is that? Because Theodore Roosevelt had to say, go thank the hostess. And take that cigar out of your mouth, too, when you do it. Well, again, Theodore Roosevelt, what goes on in that letter to Theodore Roosevelt Jr. to say that Winston Churchill is somewhat of a cheap character. Another Roosevelt he offended on the first time was in July 1918, Franklin D. Roosevelt, who was Assistant Secretary of the U.S. Navy at that time. During the First World War, he went over to do a tour of inspection of American forces in the European theater of war. And in July of 1918, he was in London, where he was invited to a dinner by his British hosts. One of the persons at that dinner was none other than Winston Churchill. Well, at the dinner, Roosevelt was asked to give an impromptu speech, and he gave a short speech about the importance of the relationship between Britain and the United States. Well, he met Winston Churchill at that time, but Winston Churchill was rude to him. He behaved like a stinker. Nobody had ever been so rude to him. By the way, this comes from the diary of John F. Kennedy's father, Joseph Kennedy, who was our ambassador to Great Britain in the late 30s, 1940. And Roosevelt is saying this to JFK's dad, who recorded it in his diary. Again, Churchill came across as rude to Franklin D. Roosevelt. Well, Churchill's experiences in the United States weren't always positive. On December 13th, 1931, he was crossing Fifth Avenue in New York City. He was looking for the home of his friend, Bernard Baruch. Well, as you know, we drive on different sides of the road. He looked the wrong way and got hit by a car going about 30-some miles an hour. Here you see him leaving the hospital, going back to his hotel, the Waldorf Astoria. Well, Churchill, bad break, severely injured, incredible wound to his head. Should have been killed by this accident. Is it a setback? Yes, a big setback. But at the same time, Churchill has this remarkable ability to take setbacks and then turn it around. While recovering from his wounds, he wrote an article called My New York Misadventure. It's really an amazing article. And he was paid $4,000 for it. $4,000 in 1931-32, I don't know what the calculation would be, but it wouldn't surprise me to do some number crunching and come up and say it's probably worth $120,000 to $150,000 today. By the way, Winston Churchill was probably the highest paid journalist in the world between the two world wars. He made his living by his writing. Well, in this article, he highlights what it's like to be hit by a car. He turned to his friend, the Oxford physicist, Sir Frederick Lindemann, and said, "Could you give me some idea, crunch some numbers about what type of impact that car had on him?" So he said, it's about 6,000 foot-pounds. In other words, the equivalent of falling 30 feet to the pavement. He said, I should have been broken like an eggshell by this accident. By the way, he kept full consciousness while they took him to the hospital. It was only when the surgeon said that he had to close the hideous wound on his forehead that Churchill then said, "Please knock me out. I don't want to have to feel that." Well, he said when he got hit, thinking he might die, that you would have the experience of your life going past, thinking about your whole life story. But he said one of the thoughts that he had as he's lying there in pain while he's surrounded by people is he said, "I won't be able to give my lecture tomorrow." A lot of us lecturers feel that way too, which is, oh my goodness, I don't want to be sidelined, so I can't give my lecture tomorrow. Again, for Churchill, this is a setback financially because he's earning his living by this lecture series. By the way, at the end of January 1932, when he finally did get back on the lecture circuit and give a lecture in Brooklyn, in the audience was the man who drove the car that hit him. Churchill, by the way, was lying on Fifth Avenue by 79th Street, said to the police officer, "The man is not responsible. It's my fault. Don't detain the driver that hit me." Again, taking personal responsibility for this accident. Now, Churchill in his recovery was very fortunate to have such good medical care. And one of his doctors was Otto Pickard. Remember, this is Prohibition America, against the law to be drinking alcoholic spirits. But for medicinal purposes, you could get a prescription for that. And so here you see Dr. Pickard making sure that the Right Honorable Winston Churchill gets the alcoholic spirits, especially at meal times. Do you think health insurance today would cover going to the liquor store? I guess not. Well, Churchill's time, beginning at the 20th century, 1900 on, Churchill's political career is an era of what we would call great power competition, of intense competition of the great powers. And we know the history, of course. This intense competition is going to lead to 2 world wars and a Cold War. Well, who are some of the competitors to the British Empire in the world? Well, here's a photograph of President Theodore Roosevelt after he left the White House, and Kaiser Wilhelm II of Germany. This is German army maneuvers in May of 1910. Roosevelt was invited to go to German army maneuvers by the Kaiser. Roosevelt was in Europe at that time giving lectures, but also to accept the Nobel Peace Prize. He had won the Nobel Peace Prize for the role he played in bringing an end to the Russo-Japanese War of 1904-1905. One of the case studies that we study in our intermediate level course here at the Naval War College. Well, while Roosevelt was there, the Kaiser's court photographer took photographs of the president and Kaiser on horseback with one another. The Kaiser then sent these photographs to Theodore Roosevelt and wrote captions on them underneath. Here's another photograph. And there's the caption underneath. Kaiser Wilhelm, of course, is fluent in English because his mother is Queen Victoria's daughter. Queen Victoria of Britain was the Kaiser's grandmother. The Kaiser, in fact, was at Queen Victoria's passing when she passed away. You can see it's written out by hand. And this is what it says. Total agreement about the general maxims of life and policy between America, spelled with a K, and Germany. These two rising powers on the world stage, these challengers to Britain, that somehow they are like-minded about wanting to bring about a change in the international system. Well, again, we know the history. These two countries ended up being at war with each other. 2 world wars. There was no general agreement between Germany and the United States about world international order. Well, like today, rising great power competition, it's often thought war is inevitable. They'll be trapped, these great powers, like Thucydides wrote about in ancient Greece, that war is in the destiny of these great powers to collide with one another. The odds are in favor of it. Churchill would have nothing to do with that. He wrote that he does not believe in inevitable wars. Wars come about by choices of leaders, not automatically because of big forces of history. Well, while Churchill did not believe in inevitable wars, there was a great war, the First World War, that began in the summer of 1914. At the time, Churchill was First Lord of the Admiralty, the civilian head of the Royal Navy. During the crisis that led to war in 1914, the July crisis, he kept the main fleet of the British Navy mobilized and ready, and then deployed it to its war station in the North Sea. The fleet was ready in its war station at the outbreak of war. The result was that Britain could put an economic stranglehold on the German economy. Here you see the Grand Fleet steaming off into the North Sea. Well, Theodore Roosevelt, when he heard about Churchill's actions to keep the Grand Fleet ready and deploy it for war, wrote to one of his friends, Arthur Lee, a British politician, and said, I really don't like Churchill, but his behavior during the crisis, making sure that the British fleet was safe, that it wasn't attacked in a surprise attack by the German fleet. By the way, the German Navy wanted to carry out a surprise attack on the British fleet in 1914, but they couldn't find it because it had steamed away from the bases that it had been in. So Roosevelt said to his friend Arthur Lee, make sure you congratulate Winston for his actions during the crisis. Well, within a month of the outbreak of the war, Churchill is giving an interview to an American audience in the New York Times. And the title of the article of the interview is Mr. Churchill on the War. And underneath, the subheading is Democracy at Stake. That's the message that Churchill's trying to get across to an American audience. Again, within a month of the outbreak of the war, Churchill is reaching out to the United States public. And he's highlighting that this war is an ideological war. It's British democracy against an authoritarian regime, as he sees it, of Prussian military aristocracy. And by the way, the Germans will, if they win in Europe, it won't stay in Europe. That they have worldwide ambitions that the United States has to be aware of. Again, this ideological aspect that Britain is waging a war against Prussian militarism. He calls it the great collision has happened, in which the democratic nations of the world, and look how he defines it, nations where the peoples own the government and not the government the people. There's echoes there of Lincoln's Gettysburg Address, of government by the people. Americans should realize what is at stake in this contest. He ends the interview by saying to his American audience, I'm half American. I have a connection to you, a family connection to Americans. Again, it's really remarkable that Churchill is beginning to reach out to the United States at the very beginning of the First World War. Well, eventually the United States does enter the war in April of 1917, and the commander of American forces in Europe is none other than the Naval War College's own Admiral Sims. And here you see a photograph of Sims from the time. Well, in May of 1917, Sims is invited to dinner by Lady Randolph Churchill, Churchill's mother. Sims writes about this dinner in a letter to his wife. He had dinner one night with Lady Randolph Churchill. And there's a photograph of Churchill's mom at the age of 63 in the spring of 1917. Sims is invited to meet Churchill, who had been First Lord of the Admiralty at the beginning of the war. Sims records that they had a long talk. And Churchill says to Sims that if the United States had not come into the war, Britain and France would have been beaten by Germany. The United States is the decisive force in the scales during the First World War in ensuring Germany's defeat. If the United States had not come into the war, Churchill believed that Britain and France would have been defeated. This is what he's telling Sims at the time. And this isn't just something to butter up Sims. This is something that Churchill very, very much believes in, the importance of American power in the world to ensure that there is a balance of power, of great powers in Europe and in Asia. Well, Churchill was made Minister of Munitions in 1917. Minister of Munitions means that he was in charge of the production of weapons, aircraft for the British Army and Air Force. He tells his senior advisors at the Ministry of Munitions, he says there's two ways of winning this war against Germany, and they both begin with the letter A. One's airplane. Churchill is an avid enthusiast for air power, and the other is America. If you want to understand Churchill's strategy in the Second World War, there it is. It's already being articulated to the British war industry of how Britain will be able to prevail against Germany in both world wars. The importance of technology and the importance of the United States. Without that support, without that advanced technology, the result will be that Germany will prevail. Well, after the war, Churchill would like to see a peace be restored to the world, that there not be a second world war. Well, in 1933, President Roosevelt's son, James Roosevelt, was visiting Britain, and he went to Churchill's country home, Chartwell, for dinner, and they played a game. The game is, if you had one wish, what would it be? What would your wish be? And so when it came to Churchill's turn to articulate what would be his one wish, this is what he wrote, what he said to James Roosevelt. He wants to be prime minister, of course. He's a political animal. He wants to be the head of Britain's government. Great ambition there, a lifelong ambition to someday be prime minister. But also using the latest technology of the telephone to be in constant communication with the President of the United States, James Roosevelt's father, Franklin. Again, if Britain and the United States work together, Churchill believes there's nothing that can't be accomplished by bringing together this partnership between Britain and the United States. Well, in the 1930s, Churchill calls it the gathering storm. The Second World War is going to come at the end of that period of the 1930s, in 1939. Churchill saw the rise of Hitler's power. He feared it. He believed that it was going to lead to war. And here you see a photograph, a really striking photograph of Hitler and the rise of the Nazis to power in Germany. Isn't this photo creepy? I find it incredibly creepy. Look at Hitler's eyes. He's looking right at us. He's demonic looking. This is evil. And look what he has done. He has this young boy, has his hands on his shoulders. He's embracing him. What's the message there? I've got your children. This is a Grimm's fairy tale of the Pied Piper. I've stolen away your children. The Nazi movement, by the way, was always an appeal to the young people of Germany. They saw the young people as being the future of the country, and they wanted especially to reach out to them. And this photograph certainly captures that. Well, we know what happens to this young boy, don't we? He's going to die in a submarine in the North Atlantic, be shot down in an airplane over Britain, or perish at the Battle of Stalingrad. Again, that generation of young people, many of whom were enthusiastic to the Nazi cause, are going to pay a hideous price for the success of the Nazi regime of coming to power. Well, Churchill warned about this from the very beginning. The Nazis come to power in Germany. Hitler becomes chancellor on January 30th, 1933. He begins rearmament. By 1935, he is openly calling for the rearmament of Germany and the buildup of German military power. Churchill already, soon after Hitler coming to power as chancellor in Germany, is warning about the danger of a new war. He gives a speech in which he says, in Germany you have a dictatorship, a most grim dictatorship. This language is very Shakespearean. It's like Hamlet. It's not just murder of Hamlet's father. It's murder most foul. This is not only a dictatorship, but a most grim dictatorship. I think that's an apt characterization of the Nazi regime. Well, Churchill was trying to reach not just a British audience about the dangers of Nazi Germany and the importance of racing in armaments against Germany. The only way to defeat Germany or to deter war was to be militarily strong and to form a coalition of like-minded countries that saw a danger from Nazi Germany. Well, this is one of Churchill's speeches in October of 1938 to the United States. When he would give speeches, by the way, he wrote all of his own speeches. He did not have speechwriters. He would have in front of him a script that he would use. He memorized his speeches, but he realized that sometimes when you're speaking, you can lose your place and forget what you wanted to say. So he always had a script in front of him, and this is what the script looks like for this October 1938 message, radio broadcast to the United States. And in which he says, Britain has to arm, America has to arm because of the great danger from Nazi Germany. But he highlights the importance of ideology again. It's not just weapons, it's ideas. There's a battle of ideas going on in the world at this time between a grim dictatorship of Hitler's Germany and Western liberal democracy. Well, the outcome is another war in 1939. And in the early stages of the war, the Nazis do very well in conquering Western Europe. First goes Poland, then Norway and Denmark, Netherlands, Belgium, and the biggest surprise of all, they're able to defeat France in a 6-week campaign in the spring of 1940. This is catastrophic and totally unexpected. Nobody thought that France would fold within such a short period of time. During the First World War, the French fought for 4 years on the Western Front, taking incredible battering and losses, but they didn't give up. In 1940, however, there was a German breakthrough. The French army was devastated, a catastrophic defeat, one of the most lopsided defeats ever suffered by a great power. Well, with France out, it was thought that Britain would make peace with Germany. Churchill became prime minister, though, just as this happened in May of 1940, of the German army marching triumphantly down the Champs-Élysées. In his first speech as prime minister, we have this famous words of Churchill. Churchill also is highlighting in other speeches, and he's known so well today, and you can YouTube and listen to these speeches, that Britain will not surrender. They won't negotiate. As he would say, no parley with Hitler. No negotiations. Yes, France is defeated, but Britain can still fight on. The British public, as you can see by this newspaper headline with the Daily Mirror, a tabloid, we never surrender. This is resonating with the British people. Here's a famous cartoon by the cartoonist David Lowe. I love this cartoon. All behind you, Winston. What you see is Winston Churchill there at the front. Behind him, some of the leading British politicians of the time, Clement Attlee, Neville Chamberlain, Lord Halifax. And as you can see, they've taken off their jackets. They're rolling up their sleeves. This is not a Marquis de Queensberry fight. This is a bare-knuckle brawl that they're going to go in. And the phalanx, political leaders all the way back of the British people. Again, an emotional determination, what Clausewitz calls passion, emotion in war, a willingness to keep fighting. Well, there's a rational side, though, too, to war. Churchill asked the British chiefs, the top military leaders, top uniformed military leaders, in the aftermath of France's defeat, can Britain still fight on with any prospect of success? And so the British chiefs respond to that question in very much a strategy and policy paper. Can Britain keep fighting after the defeat of France? British strategy in a certain eventuality. Can Britain go on in the fight? And they have to answer the question, just like we ask students here to answer their questions in essays. And a straightforward question. Well, the chiefs come back and say, yes, Britain can continue the fight for some period of time, but there are two things that will determine Britain's ability to continue the war against Nazi Germany. First is, will the United States provide support? Provide support for Britain. And secondly, another big unknown, will the British public and people who are ready to stand up to Hitler, what happens when the bombs start falling on the British homeland? Will British morale break on the home front when the bombs begin to fall? Well, again, this is something they don't know at the time. We know the history. They're making the history. We know at the time they don't know what the British public will be like. They're not sure about the United States. Will the United States be behind Britain? Or will the United States withdraw into isolationism to the fortress Western Hemisphere and say, what goes on in Europe stays in Europe. We don't want to be involved. Well, Hitler wanted to invade Britain. But to invade Britain, you have to have air superiority over the Channel so that you can do a D-Day in reverse. So you can go from France, Belgium, and the Netherlands and invade the south coast of Britain. To do that, though, you need air superiority. So the Battle of Britain begins. The German Air Force, the Luftwaffe, is sent into action against Britain. It's met by Britain's fighter command, Spitfire aircraft here, that challenge the Germans. The result of the Battle of Britain is that Britain denies Germany air superiority over the Channel. You cannot undertake a cross-channel attack without air superiority. Germany can't get it in this Battle of Britain. And as a result, Operation Sea Lion, the code name for the German invasion of Britain, has to be postponed. It can't be undertaken. Now, preventing the Germans from having air superiority to do a cross-channel attack is not the same as preventing the German Air Force from bombing British cities. And here you see a Heinkel 111 two-engine bomber flying over the Thames River in broad daylight. Scary. Here's your capital, and yet the German Air Force is able to fly over it and unleash its loads of bombs on British urban areas. Here's this iconic photograph from the end of 1940, incendiary bombs being dropped on London. The area around historic St. Paul's Cathedral, Christopher Wren's architectural masterpiece. It was feared that the dome would collapse. High priority of the government was to make sure that St. Paul's dome doesn't collapse. A signal of defiance to Germany to make sure that there isn't a collapse of St. Paul's. As you can see, the area around St. Paul's is being devastated by German bombers. Churchill, after the bombing raids, would go out to visit and see the damage that had been done and talk to the people who had lost loved ones or had their homes destroyed. He didn't hide away in some bunker somewhere. He went out to see for himself the damage that's there. And there you see Churchill with his wife, Clementine Churchill, walking through a bomb-damaged neighborhood. Churchill, when he would talk with people and see people, he would get emotional and begin crying because he understood the sacrifice that people were making to stay in the war. From the summer of 1940 to the end of 1940, December 1940, over 25,000 British civilians were killed by German bombing. So the answer to the chief's question was, what would the morale be when the cities are bombed? Well, the British people, as they would say, were able to take it. But it comes at high cost to stay in the war. By the way, it wasn't just poorer areas, urban. Buckingham Palace was bombed as well by the Germans. And the King and Queen were in residence when some bombs fell in broad daylight on Buckingham Palace. The King's resolution there. Let me just read that. Like so many other people, we have now had personal experience of German barbarity, which only strengthens the resolution of all of us to fight through to total victory. The royal family had its home hit, just like many other British of the population. Here's a photograph of the King and Queen, of course, Churchill there to inspect the bomb damage, looking at the bomb damage of Buckingham Palace. By the way, King George VI and his wife, the Queen, were important figures in British history at this time. That the royal family was seen as being in the forefront of mobilizing morale behind the war effort. The House of Commons in the spring of 1941 is bombed by the Germans as well and destroyed. The House of Commons today was rebuilt after the war. You can see here the damage, and again, Clementine Churchill with her husband looking at the damage done to Parliament by this German bombing raid. Well, in 1941, in August of 1941, Churchill and Franklin D. Roosevelt had a summit off the coast of Newfoundland, the so-called Argentia Conference. And here you see Franklin D. Roosevelt, Winston Churchill, and behind them, what do you see? Two Naval War College graduates. To the far right, Admiral Harold, nicknamed Betty Stark, Naval War College graduate, class of 1923. And next to him, right behind Churchill, Admiral Ernest J. King, a Naval War College graduate, 1933. And in the archives here at the college, you could read their strategy paper. They had to write a big strategy thesis. And when you look at the bibliography of what they read, you'll see that there's some classics there. Clausewitz, Corbett. They also read their Mahan as well. At this conference, Churchill and Roosevelt and their staffs talked about a common set of war aims. Remember, the United States isn't in the war yet. This is August of 1941, several months before Pearl Harbor. Well, here's the Atlantic Charter, which is the document that comes out of the meeting of Churchill and Roosevelt. And again, it's an expression of war aims. And what do you see in Article 6? It says, after the final destruction of the Nazi tyranny, today we would call that regime change. We're not at war yet. And that the President of the United States has signed up to say that the United States will only be secure when the Nazi regime is overthrown. As you can see, that's the whole Atlantic Charter, by the way, 8 big items. Again, this is important that the Nazi regime be overthrown so that people can live in freedom and from fear and want. By the way, this created a firestorm, political firestorm back in the United States in the battle between those who want to intervene in the war against Nazi Germany and those who are isolationists who want to keep the United States out of the war in Europe. Well, war does come to the United States. December 7th, 1941, Japan attacks Pearl Harbor. Several days later, on December 11th, 1941, Adolf Hitler declares war on the United States. Churchill is then invited to Washington. And on December 26th, the day after Christmas, he gives a speech to a joint session of Congress. And you can, again, YouTube this and hear clips of this speech. Here's the script that he had, in which he recognizes that he wishes his mother could be here. She'd be so proud of him if she could only hear him now. And he tells a joke. If you YouTube this, you see that the members of Congress are just knocked over by it and think it's very funny. He says, I can't help but reflect that if my father had been American and my mother British instead of the other way around, I might have gotten here on my own. In other words, a member of Congress in the United States. Again, this just broke up the House. Here is this important period of world history, and he's telling a joke to his audience. Again, putting them at ease as well. The speech ends with this line, that the United States, united as never before, has drawn, notice the have there, the plural. For British audiences, United States is plural rather than singular, whereas we would say United States has drawn the sword for freedom and cast away the scabbard. And Churchill, as he says those lines, his hand motion is this, to sweep away. The Churchill speech is very well received in the United States. That night, however, after giving the speech, Churchill might have suffered a heart attack in the White House. He all of a sudden felt a shortness of breath. He wanted to open a window, and he collapsed. His doctor thought that he had suffered a mild heart attack. So coming to the United States in 1931, he gets hit by a car, and in 1941, a decade later, he might have had a heart attack. Could also have been that he was just exhausted as well. Medical historians look at this and have different opinions about it. Churchill keeps up a very active schedule, though, despite having a physical collapse at this time. Well, Churchill and Roosevelt, these two famous men that would guide the Britain and the United States during the Second World War to victory. But after the Second World War, Churchill continues to play an important role in Anglo-American relations. In 1946, in March, he goes to Fulton, Missouri, at the invitation of President Truman to give a speech called The Sinews of Peace. We refer to it more popularly as the Iron Curtain speech. And there he is delivering the speech, where he talks about that Europe is being divided into two camps. And this is not what Britain and the United States had fought for. They had fought for a liberated Europe. They didn't want to see Europe divided between Western democracy and communist dictatorship. So this is a warning. Now, Churchill is no longer prime minister at this time. He's a member of parliament, but a private citizen. This too creates a political firestorm in the United States. When he goes back to New York after being in Missouri, there's a crowd of 1,000 people outside his hotel, the Waldorf Astoria, chanting that Churchill is a warmonger, trying to bring about a war between the Soviet Union and the United States. In another famous speech at MIT, on another visit to the United States, he delivers a speech about eventually the Soviet-Russian empire will collapse. He doesn't know when it'll happen, but he says at some point the lies of the system will be revealed. And in this classic line, peoples in bondage should never despair. This line, this sentence, is something that was quoted over and over again at the time of the fall of the Berlin Wall and the dissolution of the Soviet Empire, that Churchill had somehow foretold that eventually the Cold War would result in the end of the Soviet Empire. Well, for his achievements, in 1963, President John F. Kennedy made Churchill an honorary citizen. Churchill was too ill at 88 to be able to come to the United States at that time. And this is part of the proclamation that's there. In January of 1965, Churchill passed away after 90 years. His birthday had been 90 in November of 1964. And in St. Paul's Cathedral, where the cemetery, where the funeral service took place, Churchill, by the way, had a very active role in planning his funeral. Well, one of the things that was part of the funeral was to have a hymn sung that was one of Churchill's favorites, the Battle Hymn of the Republic, an American hymn being sung at his funeral 60 years ago. I remember this funeral, by the way. I remember watching it on TV as a 10-year-old. Well, here's a bust of Winston Churchill that's on Capitol Hill to mark this remarkable leader who tried to bring about a partnership between the United States and Britain, what he called a special relationship of these two powers to win in war and to preserve the peace. Thank you very much for your attention. Any questions? Yes, Brian.
Thanks for a really, really interesting talk. You mentioned that Churchill's relationship with his mom was always rather distant, typical for the age. I was wondering if you could say a little bit more. Do we know, or did he ever say, like, what was the specific origin of his admiration for the United States? Like, did it come from his mother, or was it just because of his first visit here, he was just kind of bowled over by the country? Like, what sort of caused this?
Mm-hmm. Part of it is the family heritage, which he knew that his ancestors on the American side had played a major role in American history and had been successful. And so he was proud of that heritage. Also, as an avid historian, he had studied history of the United States, especially the American Civil War. He was very much liked to read about, and also took tours of the Civil War battlefields when he was here. So part of it is a family connection to the U.S. But I do want to highlight that Churchill is very much a realistic statesman. And he understood that Britain's position in the world was becoming increasingly vulnerable. And if Britain was going to maintain an empire and be one of the world's leading world powers, the United States had to be there in the face of challenges from Germany, both Imperial and Nazi Germany, and also Soviet Russia. So there's also that rational calculation that Britain cannot defeat these powers without American support. So he's very much trying to engage the American people and government into playing a larger role outside of the Western Hemisphere in providing for the security of other countries. So, Brian, I think it's a combination of intellect and emotion.
Well, thank you again, Professor Moore. Let's give him another round of applause, please. Thank you. And that's it for tonight and for our Issues in National Security Lecture Series for the 2024 to 2025 academic year. We sincerely appreciate all of the contributions from our world-renowned faculty to our AV support team, and especially to all of you for joining the series over the course of the year. We look forward to welcoming you back next academic year for the 2025 to 2026 INS Lecture Series. Thank you. Have a wonderful evening.